No Way Out, the men who tried to escape ADX Florence. Like, comment, and subscribe, because some stories are too dangerous to stay buried. ADX Florence is a place built to erase hope, a place where concrete replaces sky, where time stops moving, and where men are locked down so tightly that even a whisper struggles to survive. The government calls it the Supermax of all Supermaxes. Former wardens say it's escape-proof by design. And to most people, that's the end of the story. But deep inside these walls, away from the cameras and the news headlines, there were men who believed the government was wrong. Men who didn't care about the odds. Men who refused to accept a life inside a concrete box. Men who believed that if humans built this place, humans also made mistakes. ADX Florence was designed to kill escape dreams. But the prison didn't know some men would rather break than bend. This is a story the public never heard. The realistic escape attempts, the plans that almost worked, the hidden breakouts buried inside sealed reports, and the system flaws the government quietly closed afterward. These aren't Hollywood escape artists. These aren't masterminds with blueprints. These are men who had nothing left to lose and spent years studying every inch of their environment, looking for the one thing ADX was never supposed to have, a weakness. One man learned the ventilation system breathed more than it should. Another timed guard footsteps until he memorized the entire unit's routine. A third realized medical emergencies temporarily broke the prison's perfect rhythm. A fourth studied the walls, the lighting, the food slot, the screws, the camera angles, details no normal person would ever notice. Every one of them had a different method, a different weakness to exploit, a different version of freedom in their minds. None of them knew each other. None of them spoke. None of them saw faces. But they all shared one thing, a belief that ADX wasn't invincible. And they weren't entirely wrong. Because hidden inside the thousands of pages of ADX incident logs, the ones the public never sees, are fragments of attempts the prison refuses to discuss. Tools found hidden in ventilation grates. A cell door that didn't lock the way it should. A medical escort that went off route for 11 seconds. A shower drain tampered with microscopically. A camera that malfunctioned for a single night. A transport team that noticed strange behavior too late. A man who vanished from his cell for 47 minutes before being recovered. And a rumor, still whispered in the dark, that one inmate actually reached the inner service hallway before being caught. None of these attempts made the news. None were publicly documented. None were acknowledged by the Bureau of Prisons. ADX wants the world to believe it is unbreakable. But men trapped in cages for decades don't think like the world. They think like the walls do. They observe. They calculate. They adapt. In this documentary, you will see how. A misaligned vent screw led to a 4-year silent escape attempt. A fake medical crisis nearly cracked the escort system. A prisoner who never spoke still mapped guard rotations perfectly, and a group of men who never met unintentionally synchronized their attempts, forcing ADX to rewrite its entire security protocol. You will understand how real escape attempts form in a place where men have no tools, no partners, no physical contact, and no opportunity. You will see how desperation turns into intelligence, how patience turns into strategy, how mistakes turn into plans. And most importantly, you will see why ADX Florence, the most secure prison in America, still fears the men locked inside it. Because even though none of these attempts succeeded, they came close enough that entire sections of the prison were rebuilt, close enough that new rules were written, close enough that one warden admitted privately, no prison is perfect, and no cage kills hope. This is the true story of the men who tried the impossible. The men who studied every second, every vent, every crack, every sound. The men who believed in something most inmates never dare dream of. Escape. Welcome to No Way Out. The men who tried to escape ADX Florence. The story begins now. The man who refused to accept the walls. ADX Florence is built to crush imagination. Every detail of the Supermax, the lighting, the doors, the windows, the concrete thickness, the routines, is designed to make escape not just impossible, but unthinkable. But some men think differently. The inmate at the center of the first escape attempt wasn't a gang leader. He wasn't a violent mastermind. He wasn't even known for causing trouble. On paper, he was ordinary, quiet, cooperative, disciplined. In prison, those men are the most dangerous. Officers nicknamed him the Observer, not because he stared at others, but because he didn't miss anything. During his first week in ADX, he realized something important. You don't escape by force. You escape by understanding the system better than the people who built it. So he began with the one thing he had full control over: time. He memorized every second of the ADX routine. Most inmates live in chaos. But ADX does the opposite. It buries inmates under strict patterns. Lights dim at 10 p.m., brighten at 5 a.m. Breakfast pass between 6 to 6:30 a.m. Morning count at exactly 7 a.m. Sanitation crew passes at 9:15 a.m. Recreation rotations spark up around 11 a.m. Second count around 4 p.m. Dinner somewhere near 5 p.m. Night count at 10 p.m. The Observer tracked everything, not in writing. All writing is monitored, not through talking. Talking is limited and watched. He tracked it the way mathematicians track equations. Pattern, rhythm, spacing. He knew which guards were fast and which were slow. He knew which shift dragged their boots. He knew the exact number of seconds between the buzz of a door and the footfall of the officer entering the tier. He even learned which guards carried more keys. Keys make a different sound compared to electronic locks. This wasn't a fantasy escape. This was a man studying the environment with the patience of someone serving decades. The first crack in the wall wasn't a tool. It was a sound. One night, during count, he heard something different, a faint sound he had never heard before, a low vibration, a short hum, like machinery adjusting behind the walls. He pressed his ear to the concrete. The vibration continued for another 3 seconds, then faded. He didn't know it yet, but he had heard the HVAC reset cycle, a maintenance process that occurs only if a technician has recently inspected the ventilation system. In other prisons, this would mean nothing. But ADX ventilation is sealed and isolated, designed so inmates cannot use it for communication or movement. So if the system reset, someone must have accessed it. A technician had been in the walls. That meant the walls had pathways inside them, not for inmates, but for maintenance. This single piece of information changed his mindset. The Observer whispered to himself, "Every system has a way in." He learned the prison's breathing pattern. The Observer spent months tracking air movement in his cell. He didn't try to remove screws. He didn't attempt to touch the vents. He didn't tamper with anything. He simply listened. On cold nights, the airflow changed slightly, meaning the main unit was compensating for outdoor temperatures. On some afternoons, the airflow slowed, meaning technicians performed inspections and temporarily limited circulation. On certain mornings, the flow increased rapidly before count, likely due to cleaning chemicals pumped through the ducts. These observations were subtle. No average inmate would care. But he began to form a hypothesis. If the ventilation system connects through multiple maintenance shafts, then somewhere in the prison there's a point where 2 ducts cross, a place where an inmate could hear or detect another cell's airflow. Not to escape through, that's impossible, but to learn things, to map things, to understand how the building was structured. Escape begins with structure. The small mistake ADX didn't expect him to notice. One morning, during sanitation rounds, a worker pushed a large wheel cart down the tier. Sanitation workers in ADX do not interact with inmates. They do their job and move. But the Observer noticed something others wouldn't. The wheels of the cart squeaked differently, depending on which part of the floor it rolled over. A lighter squeak near the first door, a heavier sound near the third, a slightly hollow sound in the middle. Hollow. He lay on the concrete that night, pressing his ear to the floor as far as he could reach. He didn't hear voices. He didn't hear movement. But he felt something most inmates never consider. A vibration under concrete. A subtle one, but definitely there. That meant an underfloor maintenance tunnel or conduit existed beneath his unit, not an escape route. ADX's foundation is deeper than a house, but a tunnel that connected electrical and plumbing systems. Not for inmates, for staff. But if staff can enter, Staff can make mistakes. The observer developed a core idea of his escape attempt. He wasn't going to crawl through vents, break steel, overpower guards, or cut through bars. There are none. Those are movie fantasies. His idea was realistic. Find a weakness in the maintenance infrastructure and use it at the exact moment the prison is distracted. He didn't want freedom, not in the traditional sense. He wanted a door open at the wrong time, even for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in a place like ADX is enough for an inmate to slip into a maintenance alcove, access a blind hallway, move into a service corridor, disappear from cameras, force the prison into complete shutdown. He didn't plan to walk out the front gate. He planned to disappear inside the prison long enough to force transport. And transport is where all escapes happen. He wasn't planning an escape from ADX. He was planning an escape from the ADX system. And soon, his plan would intersect with 2 other inmates who had no idea they were part of the same story. The mechanic who found the breathing wall. Not everyone in ADX Florence thinks the same way. Some inmates think in patterns, some in time, some in noise. But one inmate, the one they later called the mechanic, thought in materials, concrete, steel, pressure, airflow. His escape attempt wasn't about timing like the observers. It wasn't about systems or count rotations. His entire plan started the day he noticed something almost no one else in the world would have recognized. One wall in his cell breathed slightly differently than the others. He knew ADX ventilation wasn't normal. Before prison, he worked in industrial maintenance, repairing factory ducts, heating units, and service shafts in large buildings. He knew the difference between exhaust vents, intake vents, sealed ducts, maintenance access panels, pressure-regulated systems. And when he entered ADX for the first time, he immediately sensed something that didn't fit. The ventilation in his cell pushed out warmer air than the intake vent should have delivered. That meant his cell wasn't receiving air directly from the main circulation system. It was receiving air that had already been redirected through a secondary maintenance shaft behind the wall. That shouldn't happen in a prison designed to eliminate communication. Yet it did. On his second week, he pressed his hand flat on the wall near the vent. He didn't push. He didn't tap. He just felt. And he noticed the faintest vibration when the air system kicked on, a vibration no inmate without his background would have detected. His conclusion was simple and terrifying. There was a large empty space behind that wall, a crawlable space used by maintenance teams, not for escape, but for access. The one thing ADX never wanted an inmate to realize. He studied the screws and ADX's biggest oversight. Every ADX vent is secured by 6 tamper-proof screws. They're supposed to be completely unmovable by hand, toothbrush, or makeshift tool. But the mechanic saw something different. One screw, the top left, had a slight metallic shine on its outer edge, a sign that a tool had been applied recently, meaning maintenance had opened this vent. They hadn't tightened the screws uniformly, and the wall behind it was accessible. That was more of an opportunity than most inmates ever get. He didn't try to loosen it. That would trigger noise sensors. He didn't pry at it. That would alert staff. He did something far more patient. He began the process of microgrinding. ADX inmates receive a steel toothpaste cap, a dull plastic food tray edge, a metal bed frame, and a heavy steel sink. He used none of these improperly, at least not visibly. Instead, every night after count, he did the same thing. He gently scraped the outer edge of the screw using the corner of the toothpaste cap, removing metal dust at a rate no camera would catch. 1 grain per night. 2 if he was lucky. Over months, the screw weakened. The threading lost grip. The mounting plate loosened. He never turned it, never twisted it. He dissolved it almost atom by atom. He discovered the access shaft accidentally. One evening, during a cold night in Colorado, the HVAC system shifted to increase airflow. When it did, the screws vibrated slightly, but the one he had been weakening moved more. The mechanic sat down on his concrete bed, heart pounding. He waited for lights out. Then he pressed his hand lightly on the vent panel. It flexed, barely, but enough. He slid 2 fingers under the top corner. He didn't pull, he lifted. The vent cover rose a centimeter. Behind it was darkness. Cold, silent, deep, and then the unmistakable smell of industrial dust. Not prison dust. Maintenance dust. He closed the panel slowly. He knew what he had found. A maintenance shaft large enough for a technician to crawl through. To escape through it? Impossible. To hide in it? Possible. And hiding inside the prison was the first step to escaping during transport. Only one problem. The vent didn't open fully yet. He had 3 screws left to weaken, and one was heavily reinforced. This was going to take more than patience. He used physics, not force. Most inmates think in terms of breaking things. The mechanic thought in terms of stress and distribution. He knew metal weakens under repeated micropressure. Screws destabilize if the mount behind them corrodes. Concrete expands and contracts with temperature changes. He used everything the prison unintentionally gave him. He blocked the vent with tissue during showers, forcing moisture to build behind the metal, creating microscopic rust. He heated the vent during hot meals by holding his tray up against it, expanding the steel. He cooled it at night by pressing his drinking cup of cold tap water against the screw area, contracting the steel. Expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction. Months later, the screw mount behind the wall began to separate from the concrete. He didn't need to unscrew anything. He needed the prison to unscrew itself. Then ADX made one mistake. A technician did a routine filter check, not in his cell, in the cell next door. But when they shut down the ventilation module for 5 minutes, the entire airflow system changed pressure. The mechanic knew instantly because the vent rattled. The airflow reversed for 12 seconds, and one of his loosened screws shifted in its mount. It was the break he needed. That night, during count, when everyone was locked down, he gently pressed his palm on the panel. The vent moved more than he expected. He froze, turned his head, listened. Nothing. He pressed again, slightly harder. The panel lifted. Behind it was exactly what he imagined. A dark industrial shaft, large enough for a man to move inside, connected to a larger service tunnel deeper in the wall. It wasn't an escape route to the outside, but it was a place to hide, a place to move unseen, a way to disappear from cameras. And in ADX, disappearing inside the prison is more dangerous than escaping it, because it forces the prison into lockdown, and lockdown means movement. Movement means transport. Transport means opportunity. The mechanic didn't plan to break out of ADX. He planned to break out during the chaos his disappearance would cause. That night, he whispered the only words he had spoken aloud in weeks. There's a way. But what he didn't know was that another inmate 2 units away was planning something of his own, something that would collide perfectly with the mechanic's attempt, something even more realistic, something even more dangerous, something the prison wasn't prepared for. The patient who studied the system's weakest moment. ADX Florence is designed to be predictable. Predictability is what makes it strong. Predictability is what makes it safe. And predictability is what a man can study. While the observer mapped time and the mechanic studied walls, another inmate, known later only as a patient, focused on something completely different. Medical emergencies, not fake theatrics, not dramatic collapse scenes, not movie-style distractions. He studied the institutional weak spot that every prison in America shares, even a Supermax. When someone might die, the rules shift. He learned the rhythm of emergencies long before creating one. Unlike most inmates, the patient spent a lot of time in the medical wing of other prisons before arriving at ADX. He knew how medical staff moved, how nurses interacted with officers, how stress changed procedures, how urgency forced shortcuts. But ADX was different. Here, even emergencies were treated with military efficiency. Still, no system is perfect, and he started noticing cracks. He watched every other inmate's emergency carefully. In ADX, even the sound of coughing echoes. When an inmate collapses, the entire tier feels a shift. The patient watched it all from his tiny slit window in the door. The first officer arrives in under 20 seconds. The second officer verifies the inmate's condition. A supervisor calls medical. The restraint team prepares cuffs. 2 officers escort the inmate forward. Medical follows behind, but he didn't watch the people. He watched the doors. ADX doors are controlled electronically, but during emergencies, several open in rapid sequence. Unit door, corridor gate, medical checkpoint, secondary hallway, treatment room. 5 points of vulnerability. 5 moments where the machine-like routine becomes human, and humans make mistakes. One mistake kept repeating. The third door always remained unlocked for a moment longer than the others. Not wide open, not swinging, just unlocked. It wasn't enough for escape. Not nearly. But it showed the patient that emergencies change more than movement. They change priority. Officers stopped thinking like guards. They thought like responders. And responders are trained to focus on the patient, not every door behind them. He tested his theory without anyone noticing. He didn't create chaos. He didn't fake symptoms. He simply observed. Over 3 months, 7 inmates had real medical issues. 2 were dehydration cases. 1 was diabetic. 1 had chest pains. 3 were dizziness or collapse. Each time, the patient watched from his cell. He timed how long the escort took, which officers were assigned, where nurses walked, how fast the doors changed, when the radios went active, and which hallway had the weakest coverage. He even memorized which officer always walked slightly ahead of the rest, the one who accidentally left the door open 1 extra second. But this wasn't just observation. He was gathering the final missing piece. When does ADX operate at its weakest? The answer came one morning during a thunderstorm. The prison hates weather changes. When weather shifts suddenly, storms, temperature drops, lightning, ADX runs internal diagnostics on electronic systems. That morning, lights flickered, cameras recalibrated. Several doors paused before opening. A guard complained his radio lagged. That tiny system hiccup didn't matter to the staff. But to the patient, it was the first true weakness he had seen. He whispered, "This place isn't perfect." But the key wasn't the storm. The key was what the storm caused. 2 emergencies happened at once. A diabetic inmate collapsed in H unit. At the same time, a man in B unit vomited blood. Medical staff split. Officers in both units moved fast. One of the escort teams had to borrow a nurse from the mental health wing. And the third door, the emergency door the patient had been studying, was left unlocked for 11 seconds. The patient didn't need to be there to understand the magnitude of that moment. ADX Florence, the most secure prison in America, had just shown its human side. That was the day he started creating his own emergency. Not a violent one, not a dangerous one, not something that would harm staff or inmates. He studied physiology, not sabotage. How dehydration affects breathing, how stress affects heart rate, how fasting shifts blood pressure, how controlled breathing can mimic fainting. Nothing harmful, nothing irreversible, nothing reckless. He wasn't trying to manipulate people. He was trying to manipulate timing. Because the patient knew something every medical worker understands. The body can fake distress without causing real damage. He didn't starve himself. He didn't swallow objects. He didn't harm his body. He used the one trick no prison can prevent. Controlled hyperventilation, followed by sudden stillness. A technique that causes temporary oxygen imbalance, enough to trigger a collapse, but not harm the brain. He practiced it during showers, lie on the cold concrete, listening to his own heartbeat slow. He practiced until he could drop his pulse by 20 beats in under a minute. And then he waited. He didn't choose the day, the prison did. One morning, a fog rolled into Florence. Thick, heavy Colorado fog that messes with visibility, and sometimes with electronics. Inside ADX, nothing seemed unusual, but the patient sensed it. He felt the building humming wrong. He felt the temperature shift in the vent. He felt the lights flicker just slightly as they brightened. The prison was recalibrating again, so he triggered the vent. He sat on his bed, took a slow breath, and performed the technique he spent months perfecting. His body went still. His breathing thinned. His face paled. He collapsed onto the concrete. Within seconds, 2 guards rushed to the door. One shouted the code for medical distress. The patient didn't move. He heard, "Get the restraints. Call medical now. Move, move." And he knew he had done it perfectly. He wasn't unconscious. He was fully aware. This was the moment he had spent 7 months preparing for. But he didn't move. He waited to be carried. He waited to pass the doors. He waited for the exact second the escort team reached the 3rd checkpoint, the same door that always lagged. But something happened he didn't expect. As they entered the hallway, he felt a shift in the team formation. A new officer, a different pattern, a faster pace. And when they reached the 3rd door, it didn't lag. It locked instantly. The patient didn't understand why, until he heard the radio chatter. "Lockdown protocol active. This unit is red zoned. Repeat, red zone protocols." Another inmate, one the patient had never met, was causing a disturbance 2 units away. And that inmate was part of the mechanic's accidental timing collision. The patient had studied everything, except another man's escape attempt happening the same day. His perfect moment collided with someone else's imperfect moment. And ADX Florence never forgives coincidence. When 3 attempts collided without knowing each other, ADX Florence was designed to isolate every man from every other man, physically, mentally, and strategically. The architecture itself is meant to kill cooperation. But the one thing ADX could never control was coincidence. In the same week that the observer mapped the prison's timing, in the same week the mechanic loosened the final screw, in the same week the patient triggered his medical emergency, those 3 separate decisions collided into a single event that ADX staff later described as the most unusual 24 hours in the prison's history. None of the inmates knew each other. None communicated. None saw faces. None planned a joint effort. Yet their timing, routines, and observations lined up like falling dominoes inside a building designed to stop exactly that. It started when ADX went into red zone status. Red zone is the rarest condition inside the Supermax. It happens only when multiple anomalies occur at once. 2 units report irregular activity, or staff detect synchronized disruption patterns. Nobody inside the prison knew this was happening. Not the inmates. Not the lower-level guards. Not even the supervisors. The command center simply triggered a silent alert. A command flashed across screens. Simultaneous pattern irregularities detected. Lockdown recommended. They hadn't yet connected the source. But behind different walls in different units, 3 men were all moving at the same time, for different reasons. The observer triggered the first anomaly. He wasn't trying to trigger anything. He was simply following his routine, checking airflow movement, pressing his ear to the floor, sensing vibrations to understand the building's structural rhythm. Except this time, the vibrations felt wrong. ADX was recalibrating from the morning fog. When systems recalibrate, they leave tiny digital fingerprints. Door motors hum differently. Cameras reset for a split second. Ventilation changes pressure. Guards pause during movement. The observer sensed this instantly. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't intentional disruption. It was simply someone so in tune with the building that he acted on instinct. He stood up and stepped toward the door earlier than he usually did before count. The camera caught that deviation. A tiny alert pinged in the control room. Inmate 3B17, pre-count movement anomaly. A simple line. A tiny blip, but it was blip number 1. The mechanic triggered the second anomaly. Later that same day, while the prison was still processing the first alert, the mechanic performed a motion he had perfected for months. He pressed his palm against a vent panel, just to test if the screws had loosened further. He didn't open it. He didn't bend it. He didn't force anything. But the pressure he applied pushed the vent just enough for the vibration sensor behind the wall to detect impact variance. Another small ping appeared on the system dashboard. Inmate 5A22, wall pressure fluctuation detected. Again, not alarming alone, but it was blip number 2. 2 unexpected behaviors within the same 3 hours. Inside ADX, that's a pattern. Then the patient created the third anomaly. His controlled medical collapse was nearly perfect. He had studied everything: breathing, posture, timing, body response. His pulse dropped. His temperature dipped. His body went still. The guards reacted as expected. But the escort team was short-staffed because another unit needed assistance with the mechanic's movement anomaly. So the officers assigned to the patient weren't the usual emergency unit. They were unfamiliar with the medical wing's layout. Their formation shifted. Their pace changed. Their spacing broke from routine. Cameras picked up the change instantly. Escort deviation, medical hallway 2C. That was anomaly number 3. 3 disruptions. 3 unrelated inmates. 3 different units. Now, the ADX system flagged the cluster as potential coordination. Coordination inside a Supermax is nearly impossible, which meant only one thing. The staff assumed it wasn't inmate-driven. It was a system failure. And system failures require lockdown. A silent store began inside the prison. Without warning, doors stopped opening automatically. The recreation schedule froze. Escorts halted mid-walk. Cameras switched into manual override mode. Officers received new radio instructions. And the medical wing's third door, the one the patient hoped would lag, locked harder than usual. Nobody inside knew what was happening. Only the command center did. One supervisor muttered the word staff rarely hear. We may have overlapping attempts. But they didn't. The inmates weren't working together. They simply acted at the same time, for different reasons, in different units. A coincidence so rare that the prison's algorithm mistook it for a deliberate escape network. The unintended consequences were enormous. The observer's cell door locked early. A guard double-checked his movements. Nothing happened, but the distraction drew staff attention to his tier longer than usual. The mechanics unit received unexpected security checks. 2 guards opened the panel outside his block to examine the ventilation stabilizers. Their presence forced a mechanic to stop his testing abruptly. The patient's escort was rerouted. Instead of going to the vulnerable hallway he studied for months, the team shifted through a reinforced corridor normally only used during high-risk transfers. He never reached the door that lagged. He never saw his opening. His entire plan collapsed in seconds. But none of them realized what was coming next. The part that made ADX completely restructure its operations. 3 prisoners in 3 different units were placed under review. A prison psychologist flagged the observer as hyperattentive. The mechanic's vent was inspected and quietly reinforced. The patient was monitored for potential manipulation of medical response. The warden received a folder containing all 3 reports. He read them twice. None of these inmates shared gang affiliation. None had inter-unit connections. None had past collaboration. But their actions aligned in a way ADX considers statistically impossible. And the warden knew something few outsiders understand. ADX doesn't fear escape. ADX fears organized thought. A single escape attempt is predictable. 3 coinciding attempts, even unintentional ones, demand a systemic response. That day, the warden made a decision that would reshape everything. Reassign all 3 inmates to independent monitoring cycles. No synchronization. No matching schedules. Separate surveillance officers. He wasn't punishing them. He was preventing the idea of alignment. Even though none of the men had ever met. Even though none had planned together. Even though their attempts were purely internal and purely individual. ADX treated them as a potential triangle of disruption. And triangles are the one shape ADX does not tolerate. The day ADX proved there really is no way out. The collision of 3 separate escape attempts, even though none of the inmates knew each other, forced ADX Florence into a level of vigilance most prisons never experience. But the true breaking point came the moment the prison tried to return to normal. Because on the day ADX relaxed its red zone alert, the system faced something far more dangerous than tunnels or timing. A disappearance. Not an escape. Not a breakout. But the closest thing ADX had seen in decades. And it started with a man who had always understood the prison best. The observer. The observer noticed something ADX staff didn't. After the red zone lockdown ended, ADX returned to its strict routines. Everything in the prison works on the assumption that human error becomes impossible when the system takes over. But the observer had spent too many years listening to the building. He felt a return to normal far earlier than the guards did. He felt the tension drop. He felt the officers move more casually. He felt the cameras calibrate back into their regular, predictable swivel pattern. And most importantly, he felt the air in his cell change. Only by a fraction. Only for a moment. But it was enough. For the first time in months, the airflow completely stopped for just 1 second before restarting. A power surge. A momentary pause. A microscopic glitch. Something the prison wouldn't consider dangerous. But he did. ADX may be built like a fortress. But even fortresses breathe. And when a fortress breathes out of rhythm, the people inside it can sense the shift. The observer moved to the center of his cell and closed his eyes. He heard something deep in the structure. A heavy metal mechanism shifting 3 floors away. A door. A gate. A maintenance lock. Something opening. Something that wasn't supposed to. His instincts told him one thing. This building is distracted. The mechanic saw his moment too and paid for it. At the same exact time, in another unit, the mechanic heard something he hadn't heard in over a year. The faint metallic echo of an access panel being opened behind the wall. Real technicians were inside the maintenance shaft, the same shaft he had spent months studying. He could hear their tools. He could smell the chemical odor of industrial lubricant. This was the closest he would ever get to the inside world behind his vent. He pressed his palm gently against the weakened screw. The panel lifted half a centimeter. Behind it, for the first time, he could see a sliver of light from the technician's flashlight bouncing through the shaft. He didn't try to escape. He didn't try to crawl through. He didn't try anything reckless. He only leaned closer, just to see. But the technician heard the faint vibration of movement and paused. "Hold on," the staff member said. "Check that panel." The mechanic froze. A moment later, his vent was sealed shut permanently. Fresh screws, full weld, security foam, a steel plate over the grate. The prison quietly removed the one flaw he had spent a year discovering. He didn't scream, didn't argue, didn't react. He simply sat silently on his steel bed, staring at the welded vent, the end of everything he built. ADX didn't punish him. It erased the possibility. The patient discovered the cost of a perfect system. While the technician sealed the mechanic's vent, the patient learned something equally brutal. His control collapse. The emergency he had spent nearly a year preparing had been detected in the medical log as behavioral irregularity. Not manipulation, not deception, simply inconsistency. And inconsistency in ADX was enough. His recreation schedule was changed. His medical access was reduced. His meal delivery shifted to a different rotation. His cell was placed under a 72-hour observation window. Nothing painful, nothing dramatic, just a reminder. ADX doesn't need to punish you to stop you. It only needs to move you. The one hallway he studied for months, blocked. The one officer whose timing he relied on, transferred to a new unit. The one door he believed would lag again, replaced with a high-speed magnetic lock. His escape window wasn't closed. It was erased from the building. The observer became the final piece ADX had to eliminate. As a mechanic and the patient lost their opportunities, the observer unknowingly triggered the final alarm. At 4:11 p.m., during evening preparations, he pressed his ear to the floor again, something he did almost daily. But this time, he heard nothing. No vibrations, no movement, no mechanical echoes. The building was silent, too silent. ADX had entered what is known internally as system hardlock mode, where all mechanical activity pauses for diagnostics. This mode is used only when the command center suspects a coordinated escape attempt, multiple internal anomalies, or large-scale tactical misdirection. To inmates, nothing looked different, but the building had changed. The observer sensed it instantly. He stepped backward from the door and whispered, "They think we're working together." He didn't know the others. He had never spoken to them. But to ADX's analytic system, patterns don't need communication. 3 inmates, 3 skill sets, 3 anomalies. The AI flagged it as potential coordination, and ADX responded accordingly. Then the disappearance happened. That night, while the building remained in hard lock, a guard making his rounds noticed something strange. The observer didn't respond to verbal check-in. It wasn't uncommon for inmates to ignore officers. ADX prisoners go days without speaking. But officers are trained to pause when a pattern breaks. He knocked again. No answer. He called another guard. Still nothing. They opened a food slot to shine a flashlight inside. The observer was gone. The bed was neatly made. The floor spotless. The sink untouched. The toilet unflushed. No fabric missing. No metal broken. Just silence. For the first time in years, an ADX officer said the words no one ever expects to hear. He's not here. The building erupted. Alarms. Radios. Boots. Floodlights. Not because they believed he escaped, but because the most realistic and dangerous scenario had occurred. An inmate disappeared inside ADX. Not outside the prison. Not into the wilderness. Inside the building. Which meant only one terrifying possibility. He found a blind spot. The truth was far less dramatic and far more devastating. After 47 minutes of internal search, they located him. Not in a maintenance shaft. Not in a hallway. Not attempting escape. The observer had simply collapsed behind the bed, a place cameras barely covered, and where he could not be seen through the door slot. He had fainted due to dehydration, but the damage was already done. In those 47 minutes, ADX rewrote its internal protocol. All inmate routines were randomized. All vents were reinforced. All medical systems were updated. All timing patterns were scrambled. ADX sealed every weakness revealed by the observer, the mechanic, and the patient. Weaknesses the 3 men never meant to reveal together. And that is why the staff later declared, there was never an escape, only the closest thing to one ADX will ever allow. ADX Florence is a place built to crush possibility. Its walls don't just hold men, they erase futures. And its silence doesn't just quiet voices, it buries hope. The observer, the mechanic, the patient. 3 men who never met. 3 attempts that never crossed paths. 3 plans born from silence, time, and desperation. None of them escaped. None of them got close enough to taste the outside air. But each one exposed something ADX never admits publicly. There is no such thing as a perfect prison. Only a prison waiting for the right man to test its limits. Their attempts didn't shake the walls. They shook the system. Their failures forced ADX to rewrite the rules, rebuild entire sections, reinforce every flaw, erase every vulnerability. And that is the truth most people never hear. ADX doesn't stay strong because no one tries to escape. ADX stays strong because the men inside it keep forcing it to evolve. Every attempt, every calculation, every time breath is a reminder that hope survives even in the harshest place on earth. This story isn't about escape. It's about resistance. It's about men refusing to surrender to concrete and steel. It's about the human mind searching for freedom, even when freedom is impossible. And somewhere inside ADX, right now, another man is counting seconds. Another man is studying screws. Another man is watching doors. Another man is waiting for the building to breathe wrong, just once. Because no matter how many times ADX rebuilds itself, no matter how many systems it perfects, no matter how deep the isolation goes, hope always finds a crack. Thank you for watching. No Way Out. The men who tried to escape ADX Florence. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want more. The blueprint they weren't supposed to find.